Project Zomboid is a zombie survival RPG where players can fortify safe houses, scavenge whole neighborhoods, plant crops, and build communities with friends and multiplayer. Thanks to its interlocking systems and randomization, no two survival stories ever play out the same way. However, what's most remarkable is that the game itself almost didn't survive. Development began in 2011 with a small team, and almost immediately their dream project turned into a string of disasters. PayPal, without warning, froze their account containing all the money that was donated by fans. Burglars stole their laptops along with months of work that hadn't been backed up. And then, a bomb exploded in their apartment building. It was such a bizarre mix of bad luck and bad mistakes that the developers later gave a talk called How Not to Make a Game. This is a story behind Project Zomboid. The origin of Project Zomboid starts with two friends in the UK, Chris Lemmy Simpson, a programmer, and Andy Blinky Hodgetts, an artist. Growing up in the 90s, they idolized game studios like Sensible Software and dreamed of making games themselves one day. However, by the time they actually broke into the industry, the small teams of bedroom coders they admired had been replaced by massive corporations more concerned with profit than creativity. They worked on titles like Stuntman and Driver 3, and found the experience depressing. As an artist or coder, even if you were senior, you only ever worked on a tiny part of the game. You had no control. If the game was bad, you knew it, you hated it, and you couldn't change it. Simply put, they felt like cogs in a giant machine. Chris and Andy shared an apartment, and since they didn't love their day jobs, they spent their evenings making mods for games like The Sims and Civilization. They were also active on a forum called CG Empire, a community where aspiring and professional developers traded advice and feedback on projects. Among the regulars was artist Marina Su Chong, better known online as Mashed Potato. Over time, she became friends with Chris and Andy and even started collaborating with them on small projects. After CG Empire closed down, Chris and Andy left the commercial games industry behind and teamed up with Marina to start a new indie studio called The Indie Stone. Their first big idea wasn't Project Zomboid, but a fighting game called Paws. Announced in 2009, it featured cute-looking animals, including Spiffo the raccoon, which later became the studio's mascot. It was being made with the Microsoft XNA framework and was slated to be released on Xbox Live Arcade. To keep the studio afloat in the meantime, they accepted an unusual contract job. Channel 4, one of the UK's public broadcasters, had commissioned a sex education game in collaboration with Zombie Cow Studios. It was called Privates, a tongue-in-cheek shooter set inside the human body. The budget was tight and it was originally meant to be just a small flash game. However, the Indie Stone pushed to make it a proper video game. It was released in August 2010 and even won a BAFTA, but because it was distributed for free, it left the team without any post-release earnings. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, Lost in Cult. Lost in Cult is best known for some of the most high-end books on video game development you can find. With their book series Design Works, they've taken deep dives into games like Citizen Sleeper, Outer Wilds, and Animal Well. This time, they're exploring the darkest, dingiest corners of Mouthwashing's development. They're partnering with the game's developer and publisher to bring you exclusive insights into its fascinating origins, all the design decisions that were made, the game's release, and subsequent critical acclaim. Written by Ki-Hoo Chan, winner of New York Video Games Critics Circle Award, you can expect another premium addition to the Design Works series, filled with behind-the-scenes secrets about Mouthwashing's ill-fated cast and the Tulpar, the grimy, dilapidated freighter the game is set in. Right now, there's a limited deluxe edition available exclusively during its pre-order campaign that ends on November 28th. The deluxe edition offers all sorts of collectibles that are directly inspired by the game itself, and aren't available anywhere else. It's a truly premium package for the dedicated Mouthwashing fan. If this looks up your alley, you can support the channel by using the code GlenMouth or by clicking the link in the description and get 5% off this brand new Mouthwashing book, or anything else from the Lost in Cult store. Now back to the video. They switched back to working on Paws full-time, but not long after, the team grew frustrated with the XNA framework. Progress was slow, and without steady income to fund the project, the team felt like they were in a losing battle. At this time, Marina was still a student, so she wasn't too worried about having an income, but Chris and Andy were essentially broke and literally living on beans. They needed a new project, and they needed it fast. The success of Minecraft, which was sold as soon as there was an early alpha build available, made them realize they didn't have to spend years making a full game in order to start earning money. With crowdfunding, they could potentially fund the game as soon as they had a good idea and something playable. Of course, that's easier said than done. Luckily, Chris and Andy already had a project in mind. For years, the two had fantasized about making a realistic zombie game, one that aims to provide an answer to the question, what would I really do if a zombie apocalypse broke out? Back when Chris and Andy were still working for AAA studios, they never had the time to make their dream zombie game. But now, with privates behind them and pause not working out, it finally felt like the right time to start developing their dream project. Since Marina was still studying in Canada, the early days of development rested entirely on Chris and Andy. Chris handled the programming while Andy took care of the pixel art. At first, the project was simply called Zombies, and for a short time after that, Dead Territory. However, the vision was clear from the start. A zombie survival RPG where you aren't the hero, you're just an ordinary person trying to survive as long as possible. The main inspiration wasn't other zombie games, but zombie movies. George Romero's Living Dead films were the blueprint. No fast zombies and no action hero stuff. Andy and Chris also joked in an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun that they'd basically bought their game design document from writer Max Brooks. World War Z and the Zombie Survival Guide read almost exactly like the features they wanted to put in the game. Boarding up windows, pushing furniture against doors, and trying to hold out as long as you could. The game's darker tone came from specific cinematic moments. For example, in the opening of 28 Weeks Later, the character Donald abandons his wife to save himself. The scene frames him as a monster, but also as a terrified human being. That idea that cowardice could feel despicable and yet completely believable felt like it belonged in Project Zomboid. In terms of the graphics, Chris and Andy took inspiration from the original XCOM and decided to use pixel art combined with an isometric perspective. This decision was not made out of nostalgia alone, but out of necessity. Chris and Andy needed a style that was cheap to produce, easy to iterate on, and light on performance. When building dozens of animations, environmental tiles, lighting, and emergent systems, 3D graphics become very expensive and time-consuming. It also helped with consistency. If you're using a fixed camera and simpler visuals, there's less chance of weird glitches, lighting issues, or art mismatches. Over time, as the game's technology improved, they gradually moved toward more detailed rendering and overlay effects. But pixel art and isometric visuals let them get the foundation in place, prototyping faster and focusing on what really mattered: survival systems, zombie AI, procedural content, and player stories. Additionally, they also borrowed ideas from The Sims and its moodlet system that shapes how Sims behave. In Zomboid, however, those moodlets aren't things like feeling lucky or having good dreams. Instead, they're moods like panic, stressed, and pain. The duo also cited One Chance, a flash game where every decision is final and death is permanent, as a spark for Zomboid's own sense of hopelessness. In March 2011, they officially revealed Project Zomboid to the public with a blog post and a handful of screenshots. The developers explained in the post that the world would be pre-generated, but its contents, like the items you find, the quests you receive, and the characters you meet, would be different each time you play. The focus was on emergent stories and the psychological toll of survival, something that set it apart from the action-heavy zombie games of the time. And with plans to add multiplayer down the line, it looked like a promising new entry in the genre. A PayPal donate button was added to their blog, and for $5 or more, people could pre-order the alpha and secure free updates for life. There was no storefront or automated system, so each donation had to be processed manually, and emails had to be sent to each person that donated. They didn't expect many donations coming in, maybe just enough to cover rent and stop living on beans. Therefore, the extra work didn't seem like a big problem. However, rather than other online communities quickly discovered the project, and almost overnight their servers collapsed under the flood of traffic. Once the server issues were resolved, donations poured in faster than they could process. But what should have been a celebratory moment quickly turned into panic. Our brains were sort of leaking out of our ears. The worst thing was because we were taking shifts, we'd be doing it together for a bit, and then I'd grab a few hours sleep, and Chris carries on doing it, and then he gets to sleep, and I take over. You'd go for a coffee or something and come back, and there's 30 more donations to do. It felt like you couldn't ever leave your desk. And then things got much worse. Suddenly, they couldn't access their money because PayPal froze their account without any warning. Aside from the standard fraudulent behavior message, there was no explanation. They eventually learned it was in the fine print. Donations cannot be accepted for a product that doesn't technically exist yet. It was an honest mistake, but one with severe consequences. They scrambled to switch to Google Checkout, only to have that account suspended as well. To keep the project alive, they came up with a strange workaround: sell some of their old games and bundle them with pre-orders for Project Zomboid. It was a clunky solution, but it worked, and for now it was enough to keep them afloat. After 180 days, Chris and Andy could also access their PayPal account again. From the start, Chris and Andy pictured Project Zomboid as a 4-person team, 2 programmers and 2 artists. They already knew who they wanted: Marina and Nick Cohen. Unfortunately, Marina was tied up with her studies in Canada, and Nick was still stuck at the same game company Chris and Andy had left behind. The 3 of them stayed in touch, and Nick often shared horror stories about his job. Chris and Andy wanted to get him out. With all the support they'd received and donations still coming in, they started running the numbers to see if Nick could live in their apartment and join the team as a full-time member. Since there were practically no downsides, they called him up and made the offer. After Nick finished work that day at 11 p.m., he drove up to their apartment to discuss the proposal. After 12 years of insufferable grind in the AAA game industry, Nick came to the conclusion that he had enough. The next Monday, he woke up on Chris and Andy's couch as an official member of the Indie Stone. Shortly after, Will Porter joined as a freelance writer to help shape the game's narrative structure and tone. Around the same time, Marina began contributing artwork during her studies. Furthermore, Zach Beaver, at just 16 years old, also joined as a freelance composer and started assembling the Project Zomboid soundtrack. Just as development was picking up, the team found themselves in one of the strangest episodes in their history. Someone in the building next door had turned his flat into a bomb factory. Tragically, he died in an explosion. We'd been awake for 48 hours straight, trying to finish things before the first release. Finally, we crawled into bed around 5 or 6 in the morning, only to wake up to a policeman looming over us saying, "You need to evacuate immediately." We stumbled outside. The street looked like 28 days later. Abandoned cars and eerie silence. For a moment, it felt like the zombie apocalypse had actually happened. We couldn't get back into our flat for 3 days. No laptops, no access. We eventually found out what happened via BBC News 24 at the pub. Despite the donation issues and the bomb factory incident, the Indie Stone managed to release a pre-alpha demo for early supporters in late May. It served as a short tutorial that also worked as a mission statement for the game's bleak tone. Players had to care for their injured wife by scavenging for supplies in order to feed her and keep her healthy. The demo also introduced Zomboid's sandbox survival elements, laying the foundation for what the game would become. It was well received, and soon the team began releasing new builds every week or so. Unfortunately, their success was short-lived. Just weeks after the demo launched, hackers released a pirated version that included an update button that pulled the latest build straight from the Indie Stone servers. Normally, piracy means lost sales, painful enough for a struggling indie team. But in this case, every illegal download actually cost them money, since their cloud service charged for each copy that was downloaded. The more people pirated the game, the faster the team's already limited funds drained away. In response, they pulled Project Zomboid from their servers while they searched for a solution, and issued an apology to everyone who had bought a copy. Supporters were frustrated, but the team felt they had no other choice. To make amends, they released a public version of the initial pre-alpha demo for free. The real fix came with Desura, an indie game distribution platform similar to Steam. Having Project Zomboid available to purchase on Desura meant updates could be delivered easily, without the need to rely on their own servers. A few months later, in October 2011, the infamous incident happened, by far the Indie Stone's lowest point. The team had just moved into a new apartment in Newcastle when, one night, after celebrating with a few drinks, someone broke in and stole their laptops and credit cards. But those laptops weren't just hardware, because they contained months of work. Between moving apartments and preparing for the game's next big update, nothing had been backed up for 2 months. The only recent backups were on the stolen machines. When the team posted the news on their blog, the internet turned on them without hesitation. Accusations spread quickly across Reddit and beyond. No one was able to believe that they somehow forgot to back up their game for such a long time. Some branded them scammers or criminals. Trolls camped on their forums and Twitter feeds. Out of it came a new phrase, getting zomboided, shorthand in the indie scene for forgetting to back up your game and losing everything. Even at GDC, developers joked about it. For the team, it was devastating. Some fell into a deep depression. Marina, still in Canada at the time, felt powerless and wished she could just give her teammates a hug. There was one silver lining. Other indie developers, watching the disaster unfold, immediately set up offsite backups. If nothing else, the Indie Stone's very public failure became a cautionary tale that may have spared others from the same fate. Despite all the hate they received, some fans reached out with messages of support, reminding the team that people still believed in Project Zomboid. Slowly, the Indie Stone began to rebuild. The team shared their unique story of mistakes and misfortunes at Eurogamer Expo 2012. During a panel titled How Not to Make a Game. New updates gradually added new systems and features. Early builds from 2012 even included primitive NPC survivors, meant to capture the chaos of a world full of other desperate people. But the systems were unstable, riddled with bugs and odd NPC behavior. It got so bad the team had to remove NPCs from the game entirely and promised to insert them again once the game was more stable. It was around this time that Marina became a full-time member of the team. The negativity around the developers began to shift as the game's community saw how much effort the Indie Stone was putting into the game and refused to give up on it. In September 2012, Project Zomboid was greenlit on Steam Greenlight. At the time, Greenlight was a chance for indie developers to get noticed on the biggest PC platform in the world. In November 2013, after a year of preparations, the latest version of the game was finally released as an early access title on Steam. It was a huge step forward for the developers. Steam offered stability, long-term visibility, and a much larger audience than the team had ever reached before. For the first time since founding the studio, the Indie Stone could stop worrying about making rent. They finally had real financial security. That being said, development didn't suddenly speed up after the Steam release. Project Zomboid was still a complex game where every new feature could take months, sometimes years to get right. While the foundation was there at this stage, many of the promised features were still missing. It would take many more years of systems being rewritten, replaced, or rebuilt from the ground up to realize the game's full potential. In 2014, the Indie Stone released Build 26, which not only introduced 3D character models, but also an early version of multiplayer, letting players survive the apocalypse together for the first time. However, performance issues made it practically unplayable, and the mode was eventually removed. The team went back to the drawing board. In the meantime, new updates kept coming to improve other areas of the game. Build 33 overhauled sound, making everyday actions riskier and more consequential. Build 39 added vehicles, which are useful for covering distance, but the loud engine can also attract a horde of zombies. One of the more important updates came with Build 40 in 2018. New temperature and weather systems forced players to think about more than just food and zombies. Seasons changed the gameplay. Winter nights can freeze you, summer heat can leave you dehydrated, and rain can soak your clothes and spread illness. Additionally, new traits, professions, and skills were added that made survivors feel more individual. Then came Build 41 in 2021, the biggest and arguably most anticipated update in the game's history. Animations were rebuilt from the ground up, giving characters smoother movement, proper combat stances, and a new sense of weight and vulnerability. Zombies behaved and moved in more realistic ways. As a result, fights felt more desperate than ever before. Most importantly, multiplayer finally made its return. The clunky, buggy multiplayer architecture from 2014 was entirely rewritten with the help from General Arcade, a third-party studio with networking expertise. The result was stable, 32-player servers that finally delivered the experience fans had been waiting for. Within days of release, the game climbed up the Steam charts. It peaked at number 4 on the global top grossing list, and player numbers surged to new heights. Back in 2020, Project Zomboid was celebrating 5,000 concurrent players. But when Build 41 dropped in December 2021, those numbers exploded to over 65,000 concurrent players. Twitch and YouTube quickly featured lots of streams of chaotic co-op runs, bringing in a new wave of fans. In the month after Build 41 released, Zomboid Zomboid sold 23 times more copies than it had during the same holiday period the year before. For a decade-old early access title that had survived on what the developers jokingly called the drip, steady but modest daily sales, it was an impressive achievement. After a decade of setbacks and slow progress, Project Zomboid has become one of the most successful survival games ever made. The team admitted they always knew multiplayer could be big, but the sheer scale of its success was beyond anything they'd expected. We're unlikely to ever work on anything this expansive ever again. Finally seeing it break out and seeing all the wonderfully kind and complimentary comments on social media from people just discovering the game is great. Most importantly too, it's been so lovely seeing the joy that our own community seems to take from the game's success. It feels like our community has become incredibly invested in seeing the game take off. That's been really touching to see. So, what's next for Project Zomboid? In an interview with New Musical Express, Chris mentioned that NPCs are the most requested feature, and also the one they've taken the most criticism for not having in the game. Therefore, NPCs are the next big milestone, and they'll be gradually implemented over multiple updates. Beyond that, the team also wants to expand the tech tree to give players more of an endgame. Right now, survival eventually settles into a loop of farming, scavenging, and fortifying. The goal is to add more long-term crafting and building systems that give players something new to strive for. The developers have always treated Project Zomboid as their dream zombie game, a game that keeps growing layer by layer until it becomes the most detailed simulation of the zombie apocalypse anyone's ever made. They're confident they'll someday reach build 1.0, but that will also be the day the team will move on to something new. We love the game dearly, but it does take a toll, spending this amount of time working on a single project. And there is that desire to work on something new. That's always burning, but we can't do that while it's in early access. So the moment it goes to 1.0 is the day a lot of us will hang our spurs up on it forever. Maybe there will be DLC, or maybe we'll get another team, or port to consoles. But 1.0 is when we're done. And we don't want to be done until we've got exactly what we want.